As U.S. economy slows down, so do Biden's reelection hopes as Robert Kennedy rises to 19% in Democratic primary poll against incumbent president. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about the Democratic presidential primary. It's getting very interesting as Joe Biden has officially thrown his hat into the ring to seek reelection. Usually, presidents are going to run very strong in their reelection bids because it's very hard to defeat an incumbent president with the bully pulpit as his ally. Usually presidents get reelected about 70% of the time, and that's going to be very difficult for any Republican challenger, whether it be former President Donald Trump, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and anyone else that might be trying to get the Republican nomination. But what you look for when trying to gauge what are the prospects is how weak of an incumbent are we talking about? Do you have a weak economy? Is there a strong primary challenge? These are the usual predictors. And it looks like Biden might have both a weak economy and a potentially strong primary challenger from Robert Kennedy, who's thrown his hat into the ring. He seems to be spending a lot of time in New Hampshire, whereas Democrats are trying to front load their primaries and say, oh, let's do South Carolina first because that's a Democratic candidate only primary or voter primary where only Democrats can vote in that primary. And Biden, you'll recall in 2020, basically sat out Iowa and New Hampshire and went straight to South Carolina, where he won. He defeated Bernie Sanders, and then he easily went on to win the nomination as the party went around to consolidate around Biden. Bill Clinton hadn't won Iowa or New Hampshire either, and actually won in South Carolina in 1992. So it wasn't the first time that somebody was able to lose those first two contests, but then go on to win the primary, competitively in the modern primary process. No Republican has ever done it, though. Usually a Republican needs to win either Iowa or New Hampshire and South Carolina. And that two out of three tends to predict that the Republican who, say, wins New Hampshire and South Carolina, as former President Trump did in 2016, is going to go on to win the primary. But Joe Biden, could he be in trouble? Not so much for the primary challenge. Usually, as I mentioned, the incumbent president is going to be the nominee if he's running. If you're the party, you want to have your incumbent president be the guy who's going to be the nomination. And so I wanted to look at this Fox News poll, though, that shows that Joe Biden, when he's pitted against Robert Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson, the only two declared candidates against Biden, it's 62% to 19% for Biden to Kennedy. And then Marianne Williamson comes in at 9%. So Biden is sinking pretty quickly as the U.S. economy is also slowing down. So we're going to go through my piece here. I have to pull up my screen, though. And we always want to check to make sure that our sharing is going to be working the way it should be. All right. Yeah, we can see it here. As U.S. economy slows down, so do Biden's reelection hopes as Kennedy rises. The U.S. gross domestic product grew at a less than expected 1.1% annualized in the first quarter of 2023, according to the latest data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, as Joe Biden officially jumped into the 2024 race seeking his second term. Now, if you pull up the Bureau of Economic Analysis, you can kind of see what's going on with the gross domestic product. There were two negative quarters in 2022, negative 1.6% and negative 0.6% in the first and second quarters of 2022, respectively. And usually that portends a recession, but it did not show a commensurate rise in unemployment. So this could have just been kind of wartime style COVID spending coming to an end, plus pretty high inflation. The economy was not growing as fast as the inflation, nominally speaking. So it comes in at a negative rate. So you look at real GDP, is going to be an inflation adjusted indicator. But we also see that since then, the economy has kind of been slowing down. In Q3 of 2022, it was at 3.2%, Q4, 2.6%, and then Q1 of 2023 at 1.1%. So you got 3, 2, 1 there. The US economy is definitely slowing down right now, which is what you expect to happen when inflation is slowing down as well. The consumer price index is down to 5% in March of 2023. It peaked at about 9.1% in June of 2022. And it's been dropping ever since. And usually, after you get to peak inflation, you can see these gray lines here at the St. Louis Fed. These signify recessions. When you get a drop in inflation, you're going to see usually weakening demand and a recession that's going to occur. And it happens in almost every single instance. So the fact that you see inflation slowing down is probably a recession signal. And that could be why the economy is slowing down overall right now. The last shoe to drop will be unemployment rising. The question is, will it rise before 2024 when Biden is standing for general election? The news comes as upstart rival in the Democratic primary, Robert Kennedy Jr., keeps rising in the few polls willing to pit him against the incumbent president, garnering 19% to Biden's 62% in the latest Fox News poll taken April 21 to April 24. Marianne Williamson is at 9%, so you got 62 to 19 to 9. So 28% of Democratic voters in the primary are willing to say they're not voting for Joe Biden in the primary. And when given these alternatives, maybe who they haven't heard too much about, they're willing to say that they're going to vote for those instead of Biden. This shows a weak incumbent president. But this is actually even better for Kennedy. It's a 5-point improvement from a USA Today Suffolk University poll taking April 15 to April 18, where Kennedy had 14%. Whereas Biden loses 5 points just a week earlier. He had 67%. Williamson is at 5% in this poll. So here you go, USA Today, only 67% of Biden's 2020 supporters said they would support him for the Democratic nomination over his current challengers. Kennedy stands at 14%, and self-help author Marianne Williamson is at 5%. Another 13% are undeclared in that poll. And this, too, is an improvement from a morning consult poll that was taken April 7 to April 9, where Kennedy's first showing had him at 10%. So when he's right out of the gate, he's just throwing his hat into the ring. Biden's at 70%, and Kennedy's like, oh, he's at 10%. Marianne Williamson is at 4%. But then you fast forward 2 weeks and their fortunes are dramatically rising. Kennedy at 19% now, Marianne Williamson at 9%, and Biden down from 70% down to 62% in just a matter of 2 weeks. So I think this kind of wishy-washy, is Biden running, is he not running, probably wasn't helping him. So we'll see if in subsequent polls whether or not Biden's now going to get a little bump. But all he did was kind of launch a campaign launch video. There were no supporters. He didn't do a speech. Usually you go out and you make a statement, you make a speech, there's some supporters there, and everyone's cheering for you. But Biden doesn't want those optics, apparently. Why is anyone's guess. While Kennedy's chances of defeating Biden outright in a head-to-head primary remain astronomically low, they do begin to show weakness by the incumbent president, both internally and among independents, with the amount of voters willing to say they are voting for either Kennedy or Williamson up to 28% in the Fox news poll from the 14% in the morning consult poll just 2 weeks earlier. And the average I call this the rank tier Democratic wish list polls compiled by Real Clear Politics. That is polls where Biden is pitted against non-candidates in the Democratic primary rather than actual candidates. Biden's only at 35%. And you can see what's ridiculous about this is that in the average of polls, Biden gets about 34.5%, but they have him running against Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, Gavin Newsom, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Amy Klobuchar, and then Marianne Williamson. She's the only real candidate there. but they're not showing. Why are they doing a poll with all these candidates? What is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There aren't 10 people running in the Democratic primary. And it actually shows that Biden is a very weak incumbent. When you look at it this way, they should probably start just showing Biden against Kennedy and Williamson, since they're the only actual declared candidates. If you want to have an honest poll about who's running in the Democratic primary, you're not going to have this ranked tiered wish list. That's what I like to call it, average from Real Clear Politics. But we'll just keep making fun of it until they change their polling data to start pulling the polls that actually show real candidates who are running in this, like Robert Kennedy and Marianne Williamson. Even if they're long shots, it's Kamala Harris is not going to run against the incumbent president. Bernie Sanders, well, he might run. He always, he's run some spoiler challenges in 2016 and 2020 where it looked like he was winning. In New Hampshire, particularly, he had a lot of momentum, but then Biden shows up in South Carolina. And now Democrats are trying to interdict the traditional primary process by front loading South Carolina, which is very controversial. Democrats are basically giving the middle finger to independents and saying that, oh, we don't care what you think. Your Iowa caucus and your New Hampshire primary, yeah, we don't need those anymore. We can go in South Carolina first. Now, 1912, 1932, 1952, 1968, 1976, 1980, and 1992 all saw incumbent presidents with significant primary challenges. In every single case, though, the incumbent president either declined to seek re-election, as with Harry Truman in 1952, who lost a New Hampshire primary, and in 1968, when Lyndon Johnson barely beat Eugene McCarthy and then decided to withdraw from the race altogether. Or they do seek re-election and they don't do, particularly well. In none of these cases did the strong primary challenger actually go on to become their party's nominee. So you can kind of discount any hand wavery by Kennedy's detractors about the potential spoiler role in the race he might be playing. So we can go through some of these examples. They're quite famous. The 1912 Republican Party presidential primary saw Theodore Roosevelt actually getting more votes, 51% of the votes in the states that had primaries, compared to William Howard Taft, the Republican incumbent president, who only got 33% of the vote. Now, when you look at this, you say, oh, why was Roosevelt running against Taft? Well, he wanted to be president again. He wanted to go for a third term, and he thought Taft, I guess, was doing a bad job, or in any event, there was some rivalry there. So he didn't like Taft, so he wanted to play the spoiler or something like that. But you get the feeling that if Republicans had just determined to go for Roosevelt, they probably would have stood a better chance in the election. Instead, in 1912, Woodrow Wilson got elected as Roosevelt ran on the third party ticket, the Bull Moose Party. If you look at the 1912 presidential election, it's actually quite interesting where actually Roosevelt does better than William Howard Taft. William Howard Taft only got 23% of the vote, 3.5 million votes, whereas Roosevelt got 4.1 million votes at 27%. And that made it easy for Woodrow Wilson to win with 6.3 million votes, or 42% of the vote. So clearly, Roosevelt was a stronger candidate than William Howard Taft was. So maybe at the nominating convention, they should have paid attention to the primary. And so that's one example where a weak incumbent who does poorly in the primaries kind of portends that they're going to do poorly in the general election. That's why primaries are an important feature of the modern process, where parties have said, wait a second, we should pay attention to these primaries. They seem to be quite important. They're telling us something about the strength of the candidates. And Republicans, it took them a few cycles of not doing too well in the where the incumbent president's not doing too well, or the candidate they're choosing at the nominating convention didn't do too well in the primaries, and they end up losing the general election. 1932 is another example. You're in the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover has got his back up against the wall. Republicans got clobbered in the 1930 midterms. And you look at the primaries, and Joseph France actually did better than Herbert Hoover in the 32 primaries. He got 47% of the vote with 1.1 million votes, and Herbert Hoover only got 860,000 votes at 36%. Again, that not every state was doing primaries, so don't let the numbers fool you in terms of like, oh, that's not a lot of people voting. But these are still indications of how well a candidate is going to do in the general election. Franklin Roosevelt, he crushed Herbert Hoover in the 1932 election. And we'll pull that just so you can kind of get an idea of just how lopsided this was. Franklin Roosevelt got 57.4% of the vote with 22.8 million people voting for him. And Herbert Hoover only got 39.6% of the vote at 15.7 million votes. And he only won 6 states. This was an utter landslide. Republicans would then lose even more seats in the 1934 midterms. Roosevelt picked up a bunch of seats, and Republicans were driven almost to the point of political extinction during the Great Depression. And so it just goes to show you should pay attention to what's going on in the primary, because it could have a very it can have an impact. It doesn't, it doesn't cause the outcome. What it does is it shows weakness of an incumbent heading into a general election. And in 1952, this is another example. Harry Truman actually didn't end up running. He lost the New Hampshire primary, and to Estes Kefauver, who actually got 64.6% of the vote in the Democratic primaries, but he doesn't actually become the nominee. They go with Adlai Stevenson that year against Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower wins pretty easily there, but he got 64% of the vote. Richard Russell, 7%. And I don't even see Adlai Stevenson on here. Where is he? There he is. He's down here. There's Adlai Stevenson. But he wasn't even running in the primaries, or he didn't do very well. He didn't win a single state. But you can see back then there weren't as many states using primaries as the way of gauging who the nominee was going to be. You can see here Truman declines to seek another term on March 29, 1952. And we can go look at that. The decline and fall of President Truman. The expected candidate for the Democratic nomination was incumbent President Harry Truman. However, Truman entered 1952 with his opinion poll popularity plummeting. The bloody and indecisive Korean War was dragging into its third year. Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade was stirring public fears of the encroaching Red Menace. This is Wikipedia, so take a grain of salt with it. And the disclosure of widespread corruption amongst federal employees, including some high-level members of the Truman administration, left Truman at a low political ebb. Truman's main opponent was populist Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver. I have a hard time pronouncing that, who had chaired a nationally televised investigation of organized crime in 1951 and was known as a crusader against crime and corruption. The Gallup poll of February 15 showed Truman's weakness. Nationally, Truman only got 36% compared with 21% of Kefauver. That's kind of where Biden is right now, 35% of the poll. So that's another indicator there of the weakness of Biden right now. Among independent voters, however, Truman only had 18% and Kefauver led with 36%. And then in the New Hampshire primary, Kefauver shocked the world. He upset Truman, winning 19,800 votes to Truman's 15,927 and capturing all 8 delegates. Now, eventually, this showed that Truman was absolutely going to get crushed, even if he was going to go on to win the 1952 primaries or beat a nominee. Eisenhower was going to beat the tar out of him, and so he declines to seek another term, March 29, 1952. This day in history, this is from Politico. After being upset in the New Hampshire primary by Estes Kefauver, President Harry Truman, who had taken office in April of 1945, said on this day in 1952 that he would not run for what effectively would have been a third term. Truman declared, quote, "I have served my country long, and I think effectively in honesty." Now, obviously, he was very unpopular. And so yeah, I think if he had been leading the polls, if he had won New Hampshire decisively, he probably would have ended up running. But clearly, having a weak primary showing can show, can predict that the incumbent party is not going to do too well in the reelection. So here you have Harry Truman dropping out. The 1968 Democratic primary, something very similar happened where LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, had a very weak showing in the 1968 New Hampshire primary, and he ended up pulling out of the race, and then Richard Nixon ends up winning in 1968. You have the 1968 Democratic primaries. Eugene McCarthy actually had the most votes. Robert F. Kennedy actually died. He was assassinated. He actually got 30% of the vote. And if you look at the results, you can kind of see what happened to LBJ. Running as an anti-war candidate in the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy hoped to pressure the Democrats into publicly opposing the Vietnam War, trailing badly in national polls and with little chance to influence delegate selection. McCarthy decided to pour most of his resources into New Hampshire, the first state to hold a primary election, and McCarthy won 42% compared to Johnson's 50%, an extremely strong showing for such a challenger, which gave McCarthy's candidacy legitimacy and momentum. Now, Johnson had not filed, and McCarthy was the only person on the ballot. So Johnson was actually only a write-in candidate. So this gives you the idea that just because Joe Biden might want to skip the New Hampshire primary like he did in 2020, it might not help him to be losing delegates and to lose a state and to say, oh, I don't need to, because if you're an independent, you can vote in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire. It's an open primary. Donald Trump did very well in the New Hampshire primary in 2016. And a big reason for that is because independents were saying, hey, look at Donald Trump. He's running on a trade agenda that's going to bring jobs and factories back to the United States. He wants to build a wall on the southern border. There was a lot of momentum for Donald Trump in 2016, and it showed up in New Hampshire after he narrowly lost the Iowa caucus to Ted Cruz. And then Trump was off to the races. He wins New Hampshire, he wins South Carolina. And by then, he pretty much already locked up the Republican nomination because no other candidate who had lost South Carolina and either New Hampshire or Iowa had gone on to win the Republican nomination in modern history. So this once again shows that a weak showing in the primaries can really, really hurt you. In 1976, incumbent President Gerald Ford, he ran against Ronald Reagan in the Republican primary, who was the challenger, and it showed that Gerald Ford was actually a weak candidate in the 1976 presidential election. And even if it was kind of close, it showed that there was vulnerability there. Richard Nixon had left office. He had resigned. He had the Watergate scandal, that cloud looming over the Republican incumbent who had pardoned Nixon. And that was going to hurt him perhaps in the general election. But this showed that Ronald Reagan was also a very popular conservative candidate. And Gerald Ford barely beats him in the primary, 5.5 million, 53% to Ronald Reagan's 46% at 4.7 million. And Ronald Reagan would go on to win the Republican nomination in 1980 very easily as the next in line, kind of a fan favorite. Everyone was like, oh, yeah, if only we had run Reagan in 1976, we could have beaten Jimmy Carter, the Republicans were saying. So this is just another example where when you have a competitive primary, you might go on to lose the general election. It's a pretty solid record of defeat. 1980 Democratic primaries, another example, Jimmy Carter, he's up against Ted Kennedy, who has a competitive primary with him. Now, Jimmy Carter wins the nomination, 10 million votes to 7.3 million, or 51% to 37%, but it showed 37% of Democrats wanted somebody besides Jimmy Carter. You had high inflation, you had high unemployment heading into 1980, and Jimmy Carter wasn't going to do too well in the general election against Ronald Reagan, who was a very popular Republican candidate, and would go on to utterly crush Jimmy Carter. I love this example because it shows that you can really do damage to an incumbent president when you have a weak economy, but also a competitive primary challenge. And Ronald Reagan, it was a landslide, 44 states to 6 states. for Jimmy Carter, Reagan to Jimmy Carter. It was just an utter landslide for Reagan. And it showed that somebody who runs very strong in the primary on the Republican side versus someone who runs very weak in their own primary, an incumbent president should easily win their nomination. And it wasn't so easy for Jimmy Carter. And if you look at the results of the 1976 or 1980, I'm sorry, Democratic primaries, Jimmy Carter actually, you could see early on in the process that he was going to have trouble in the general election just by how he did in Iowa and New Hampshire. In Iowa, he gets 59% of the vote. Kennedy gets 31% of the vote. So Iowa caucus goers, they were saying, Jimmy Carter, he's washed up. He's not going to do too well in the general election. We better go with Ted Kennedy. And in New Hampshire, same thing happened. 47% only voted for Jimmy Carter, 52,000 to 41,000 for Ted Kennedy, who got 37% of the vote. So once again, if that happens, that's probably a really bad sign for the incumbent president. Something like this could happen when the incumbent Democrat runs for re-election that year. And it goes both ways. In 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush, was running for a fourth consecutive Republican term. Reagan had been reelected, and then George H.W. Bush wins in 1988. But when he's running in 1992, you have a recession and you have a competitive primary challenge. Now, Herbert Walker Bush, he got 73% of the vote. Pat Buchanan, the respectable 23%. What did this really indicate was that there was weakness. There were people in the Republican primary who were like, Bush, he's kind of washed up again, just like Jimmy Carter. You got a recession. Maybe we should go with Pat Buchanan because he might have a better shot in the general election because his policies won't be on the ballot then, or something like that. And if you look at the Republican primaries, there was no Iowa caucus that year, but there was a New Hampshire primary, and George Bush only got 53% of the vote, 92,000 to 65,000. Pat Buchanan got a whopping 37.5%. And that's very similar to how Ted Kennedy did in 1980. He got 37% of the vote in New Hampshire as well. So it's a question of if this is how well Robert Kennedy is doing nationally, could he actually do very well in New Hampshire? And would that portend a very poor showing by Joe Biden in the general election? Could we be heading in that direction right now? It's a very good question. And so again, people are going to say, oh yeah, Kennedy, he doesn't have a shot. So if he can't defeat Biden outright in the primary, that means that Joe Biden's going to do just fine at the general election. Wrong. We just went through all the numbers, why that's wrong. And that would be the wrong way of analyzing it. George Herbert Walker Bush didn't lose to Bill Clinton in 1992 because Pat Buchanan gave him a competitive primary. It's the other way around. Pat Buchanan was able to wage a competitive primary because the incumbent president had weaknesses that were easy to expose in a competitive primary, not to mention the fact that Republicans by that time had occupied the White House for 3 consecutive terms already. The longer one-party rule goes on in the White House, the more likely independents are to say it's time for a change. Now, the economy, among other issues, looms as another sword of Damocles for Biden, a key metric by which one can begin to judge an incumbent president's chances of being reelected. The GDP in the fourth quarter of 2022 was moving at a swifter 2.6% and an even swifter 3.2% in the third quarter. We went over those numbers earlier. And you can look this up at BEA.gov. That's the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And they'll show that you have a pretty weak economy headed into the second quarter right now. You have the banking crisis is starting to pick up again. Silicon Valley Bank it obviously has failed. So did Signature Bank. But now First Republic could be heading to FDIC receivership, as well as whatever kind of capital injections that Wall Street's been trying to put into First Republic appear to be failing to restore confidence in the regional banking sector. And which, by the way, the economy's slowing down. This is what usually happens after peak inflation. We looked at this earlier as well. It peaked at about 9.1% in June of 2022, and it's all the way down to 5% in March of 2023. And so that could be portending, very poorly. You see the inflation going down. You see inflation going down when there's recessions, or you see it peaking at the moment of a recession. Then demand's going to be much weaker, so prices come down. That's what happens when the economy overheats in the 1970s and the early 1980s. 1980, you had peak inflation at 14.6%. And that was going to bode very, very poorly for Jimmy Carter in the general election. Just look at what happens when you have a really poor economy. And you can get a landslide like this. That I don't. You go to 1984, and Ronald Reagan actually wins. What was it? 49 states or something like that. We could go forward. Let's see. How many states did Reagan win in 1984? Yep, 49 states to one state against Walter Mondale. So you had a strong incumbent here. This is not, I think, the experience that Joe Biden has in for him. If he had a really strong economy, he would, and people had confidence in him, they wouldn't be saying that, we prefer Robert Kennedy in a primary poll, or Marianne Williamson at 9% now. And that's probably because most say they have doubts about Biden's fitness for the presidency. Is Joe Biden mentally fit to serve as president? This is Harvard Cap's Harris poll. It says that he is mentally fit. Only 44%, 56% of voters say, I have doubts about his fitness. And that breaks down to 78% of Democrats who think he's fit, to only 22% who say they don't think he's fit. But that's 22% of Democrats are saying that he's got problems. 63% of independents say that he's not fit. 84% of Republicans predictably think he's unfit to continue to be president. And do you think Joe Biden is showing he is too old to be president, or do you think he is showing he is fit to be president? If you ask the question, showing he is too old, 67% say he's too old to be president. He's 80 now. He'll be 82 running for reelection if he wins reelection in 2024. Only 33% say he's fit to be president when asked against whether he's too old. And even 37% of Democrats say he's too old. 93% of Republicans, 76% of independents think that Joe Biden is too old to run for reelection, but he's doing it anyways. He's throwing caution into the wind, and he's not paying attention to the primary polls. But maybe what he is paying attention to is the record of what happens when the incumbent president decides not to seek reelection. Harry Truman declined to run because he was weak in the primaries, and the Democrats went on to lose against Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1968, the same exact thing happened where, LBJ exits the race just because of a poor showing in the 1968 primaries. And it went on to, have Richard Nixon getting elected. So this has happened before where an incumbent president steps aside and then the incumbent party loses anyways. So it might be darned if they do, darned if they don't. That's another way of looking at it. Now, the next leg of the economy story, the last indicator of the move south, are usually jobs. But with the unemployment rate still at a historic low of 3.5%, it appears the job losses for the current economic slowdown remain on the horizon, if they come at all, in the wake of the continued baby boomer retirement wave that has led to job shortages. So if you look at the unemployment rate here, it's still at a historic low of 3.5%. But we've noticed this in the past, where when the consumer price index is dropping, it usually portends that you're going to see a commensurate rise in unemployment. It just hasn't happened yet. When you look at the White House Office of Management and Budget, this is Joe Biden's, he's obviously the president, and there's the Office of Management and Budget, and they have economic assumptions that they plug into their budget. So what does the Biden White House see on the horizon? They see only 0.6% real GDP growth this year. And this may be coming true because it got only 1.1% in Q1 2023. So 0.6. Well, to get to 0.6 off a 1.1 first quarter, you probably have to see a negative either second, third, or fourth quarter to have it average out to just 0.6%. They also see unemployment rising this year to 4.3% above the 3.5%. And then by 2024, 4.6%. That implies about 2 million job losses that Biden will have on his record when he's running for reelection, whether it's against Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or whoever the Republican nominee is going to be. So that this could be, if true, amounts to 2 million job losses dead ahead, with Biden having to run for re-election in the midst of a recession. That usually doesn't do too well either. And then again, GDP softening to 0.6% in 2023. And now job openings, those have been softening too. So you have baby boomers retiring at a record clip, particularly after COVID. And so you can see after COVID, job openings went from a low of 4.6 million to all the way above 12 million in March of 2022. So you go from, what is that, April of 20 to March of 2022 to 12 million job openings as baby boomers are retiring. And so it's just like, how do we fill in all these positions that were once held by older baby boomers? And there's just fewer workers, because after the 1960 birth control, fertility has been declining at a rapid clip. And so people had fewer kids and that means that there's going to be fewer workers to replace the baby boomers. And now, but even despite that, job openings are now down to 9.9 million in February of 2023. I guess we'll have to wait a few weeks for the next number to come out, but usually, and the JOLT survey hasn't been around that long, but usually you see declining job openings during a recession. It's happened in 2001 and it happened again in 2007, 2008. You see declining job openings in COVID as well, because, everything was closed up. So it's like nobody was hiring in the middle of the lockdowns. And so you saw job openings drop from 7.1 million in January of 2020 down to 4.6 million in April of 2020, when 25 million jobs were being lost. And so how many job losses will we see in an upcoming imminent recession? Federal Reserve, OMB say about 2 million. That could weigh on Joe Biden's reelection hopes. The remaining question might be less whether a recession is on the horizon than whether a rise in unemployment happens before or after the 2024 election. So these are kind of imprecise calculations when you think about job openings declining, inflation dropping, and how soon will the unemployment rate tick up? And will it tick up when you have that many people, that many job openings? Maybe the unemployment rate going up will be tempered by the fact that there's still 9.9 million job openings. So the retirement wave could have a contrary effect on what would otherwise be a significant downturn. Something to keep your eyes out for, eyes open for, eyes peeled. Fact is, incumbents are really, really hard to defeat. So just because the U.S. economy is softening right now, it doesn't necessarily mean it went from 3.2% to 2.6 to 1.1% in Q1 2023. Doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get a recession, but the odds are, pretty darn high when there's that many indicators. The 10-year, 2-year Treasury has been inverted, since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. So that could be another, weakness point that you want to keep your eyes peeled for. But yeah, incumbent presidents are really hard to defeat in re-election bids with about a 70% historic re-election rate. There have only been 11 presidents defeated in a re-election bid since the first presidential election in 1788 to 1789. We got John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Benjamin Harrison, William Howard Taft, Herbert Hoover, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush, also Donald Trump. And we probably missed one of those there. Let's see, Hoover, Taft, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland. Okay, so they didn't mention Grover Cleveland, who actually went on to defeat Benjamin Harrison after losing to him. Grover Cleveland, Democrat Grover Cleveland, was the 22nd and the 24th president of the United States, having served from 1885 to 1889 and 1893 to 1897. So he doesn't technically qualify as a one-term president, but because Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive 4-year terms, he holds an important place in U.S. history, having lost his initial bid for re-election in 1888 to Republican Benjamin Harrison. So this is an interesting case, the Grover Cleveland case. This is the case for Donald Trump in 2024, who will also be seeking non-consecutive terms. So Grover Cleveland lost his reelection bid, but then he goes on to win his second reelection bid. Could Donald Trump, do the same thing? Now, the flip side of that is Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, who is also going for a non-consecutive term, in this case, a third term, but he didn't defeat Woodrow Wilson in 1912. But if he had been the Republican nominee, he might have been able to pull it off. But back then, the primaries were brand new, and so the parties didn't really realize they needed to select the most popular candidate in a primary. But invariably, when you look at the numbers, you're far better off choosing the person who's winning the primaries when you're going to have a reelection bid. 1912 is again a classic example. Helmut Norpoth, my professor at Stony Brook University, he developed what was called the primary model based upon this experience. And so I actually got to study the primary model when I was at Stony Brook. And it definitely shows that the stronger primary person is the guy who's going to do better at the general election. So there was some talk, even though Donald Trump won the 2016 primaries, would the Republicans choose somebody else at the convention? Now, fortunately for Republicans, they went with Trump, and then they went on to defeat Hillary Clinton. But if they had done that, think of how many Trump voters would have stayed home in 2016 if they had chosen somebody besides Donald Trump. And so again, in 2024, Trump is leading Ron DeSantis and other Republican challengers in the Republican primary. If Trump's winning the primaries, will they try to keep him out of the nomination in 2024 at the convention? All experience tells you that that's a horrible idea. If you're trying to win the general election, if you're trying to defeat Joe Biden, who seems to be a pretty weak incumbent right now, you're probably going to want to go with whoever's winning the primary. In any case, in the 1880, there were two. Only twice has there been two consecutive one-term presidents. So usually you get a one-term president, and then it's going to be followed by a two-term president. But in the cases, it was 1880s and 1890s. It was Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. And the modern cases, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, who were two consecutive one-term presidents. So that could happen again. That would be the third time in presidential history. So if Donald Trump, if he gets the nomination, he'll make history. If he defeats Joe Biden, he'll also make history. The fact that he's running again is also making history. So the bully pulpit is an enormous advantage, but the two predictors out there that portend badly for an incumbent president are recessions and competitive primaries. And with the GDP slowing down and Robert Kennedy Jr. rising, looks like Joe Biden might have both. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day. Let's take a look at the comments. Let's see what you guys are saying there in the chat. All right, go back to the beginning. Here we go. We can also click over here. We don't need the screen anymore. Florida Girl, thanks for joining us from YouTube. Debates are necessary and needed. If Joe Biden's going to be challenged in a primary, should he have to debate Robert Kennedy if he's going at 19% in the polls? Will it look like Joe Biden is even weaker if he's running scared from Robert Kennedy? That's a good question. Sherry Kerr, all the felons who voted for these people will vote for him again. They don't care about our country. But you can have more moderate Democrats, more classically liberal Democrats who maybe want to see Robert Kennedy or somebody different, someone who's not Joe Biden, independents who get to vote in places like the New Hampshire primary. So it's not simply Republicans and Democrats who vote in presidential elections. So you want to pay attention to what independents are saying and also what people in the primary process are saying. Donald Trump would have never been elected without Democratic union households in Michigan and Pennsylvania voting for him, probably because of his trade position that was more like Bernie Sanders. There were a significantly high percentage of Bernie Sanders voters who actually voted for Donald Trump. So as a candidate, as a challenger running against an incumbent president, if you're going to win, you got to pick up some. If you're a Republican running against a Democrat president, you got to pick up some Democratic votes, and you got to win independents. It's the only way to defeat an incumbent. It's not going to just be, oh, there's going to be more Republicans than Democrats. There aren't more Republicans than Democrats, for starters. So you're going to, you're going to start out at a disadvantage if you look at the presidential process and election process as merely a partisan affair. It is not. Independence or the kingmaker. So you gotta win independence. Patricia Brown. I used to call this administration a clown show, but this isn't funny anymore. Clowns are supposed to be funny. This is an S show. Let's see here. Carolyn Mezzanotti, thanks for your comment. Jacobs, that's what we thought in 2020, but he slithered his way in. They're not above cheating, and unless they're held accountable and punished, we're screwed. Or you could just win a significant percent of Democrat voters and win independents. That's how you're going to win the election. That's usually what happens. So if you don't show up to vote, I mean, that's another possibility. The Republicans have lost faith in the primary or even the election process after Trump's 2020 challenge. Could that depress turnout for Republicans in 2024? Something to keep your eyes peeled for as well. Stanley Matthews, I hope Biden loses. Tim Gingro. It's kind of a silver lining, maybe. My fear is that there'll be another miracle 3 a.m. surge of Democrat votes in 2024. Well, it's very difficult to defeat an incumbent president in any event. Donald Trump barely lost a very scant 69,000 votes. What was it? 10,000 in Georgia, 10,000 in Arizona. 43,000 votes. 43,000, 10,000 in Georgia, 10,000 in Arizona, 23,000 in Wisconsin, which if they'd gone the other way, the Electoral College would have been tied 269 to 269, and then the election would have gone to the House of Representatives. So Joe Biden, he didn't run so strongly in the primary. Trump should have easily won. And I think he would have been on his way to an easy re-election, but for COVID. COVID changed everything. The economy tanked, 25 million jobs were lost. And then you had the whole mail-in ballot thing where Democrats were able to maximize their turnout by using the mail-in system. Republicans distrusted the mail-in system. They were telling their people to vote in person, not to trust the mail-in ballots. But if they just kept an even keel with Democrats on early voting, if you're a Republican, you're thinking about 2024, you probably want to embrace early voting, because if you just match what the Democrats are going to do via mail-in or early voting, and then you win on election day, then Joe Biden's not going to be reelected. That's how you beat Joe Biden in the election. So it's not a question of people being punished or held accountable. You're the American people. You have to hold the incumbent president accountable at the polls. That's our system. There is no alternative, I'm afraid. Let's see. Michael Luzuski, thank you for your comment. Democrats have flooded those 4 key states that determine our election with so much crime and illegals and passed bills to allow them to vote. It's going to be hard to get our country back into control unless local authorities ignore the laws forced on them to start holding them accountable and lock them up. Again, I don't know. You can have state attorneys general try to enforce, and state secretaries of state try to, and you're going to enforce your state election laws. And I don't think mail-in balloting is going to be as popular as it was in 2020. So will Democrats be able to maximize their Democratic machine turnout in 2024? Joe Biden, I bet you, is betting on it, that they know this system now, and they can do early voting. If Republicans embrace early voting, Donald Trump says he's going to do mail-in ballots. He's going to do early voting this time. He's not going to reject it. Could Republicans, increase their turnout? So Trump went from 63 million to 74 million, an improvement of 11 million. Running Trump 3 times is 3 times the charm. Do Republicans, could they catapult to like 80 million votes in 2024 with Trump running and building the Republican Party, as he seems to have been able to do in 2016 and 2020? Trump didn't lose votes to Joe Biden. Like, everyone's like, oh, he lost suburban women or something. He didn't lose any votes. He went from 63 million to 74 million. It's just that Democrats were able to maximize turnout with favorable election law changes. Florida girl, Pocahontas, Mr. Ed's granddaughter, a pot-smoking ladder climber, and other. Um, Florida girl. Now that is funny. Responding to the chat. I love that you guys are talking to one another. Let's see here. Mary Alice Lintz, Democratic Party doesn't want a debate with Kennedy or Marianne Williamson. They just want Biden the puppet. So yeah, will the Democrats allow a debate between Joe Biden and Robert Kennedy and Marianne Williamson? Will more Democrats throw their hats into the ring to try to get Biden onto the stage? My guess is that Biden's going to just ignore the primary challengers. He might even skip New Hampshire altogether, just like he did in 2020, because he doesn't think it matters. And if you got the Democratic machine working for you, maybe it won't matter. It seemed to work out to his advantage in 2020. It didn't hurt him to skip Iowa and New Hampshire, and although you would think it would. Here's Clara Nussbaum. We Republicans should be at every entrance of every drop box 24 hours a day. We could do it in shifts with cameras. I cannot believe there's nothing we can do to stop voter fraud. Come on, Republicans, get loud and call your senators, representatives, anyone, and tell them to grow a pair and stop criminal behavior. Again, you have state legislatures, obviously, and state governors and secretaries of state. Are they going to be pushing, early voting the way they did in 2020? I doubt you see turnout to the extent on early voting as you did in 2020, but anything's possible. You could see early voting continue to rise. And if Republicans want to compete, they're going to have to engage in early voting. So you could say, oh, we're going to try to restrict voting, or you could just say, let's turn out our people too. If you're a Republican, we can play the same game. Republicans in California, they lost a few seats in 2018 during the midterms, Trump's midterms, that because of ballot harvesting, which is legal in California. So they said in 2020, we're not going to do that again. We're just going to go collect ballots too. And then they were able to win a few seats back. So it's not as if that Republicans are incapable of doing early voting, of doing mail-in voting. I'm pretty confident you can all find your mailboxes. If you choose to vote early by mail, or if you want to go to the polls early, you could do that too. You don't have to vote on election day. You can vote before election day. And Democrats are figured out that once you cross people off the list. So the reason why this is advantageous, by the way, is you have all your likely voters. And so if you're a campaign, you're going to look at your likely voters. You're going to say, all right, who's already voted? And therefore, who do I need to turn out on election day because they haven't voted yet? If Republicans have a way bigger list of people who haven't voted yet before election day, then it's going to be more difficult for them to catch up to what will be an early lead for Democrats in early voting. So, I mean, you don't even need fraud for the Democrats to win in 2020. You just need mail-in ballots and early voting and Republicans rejecting early voting. And that alone might explain the outcome. Or maybe Trump would have gotten way more than 74 million if they had just been pushing early voting. You never know. They did pretty good on election day. Trump was running very strong in 2020 down the stretch. And they probably picked up a bunch of House seats because Trump was doing that day of election kind of push that probably helped them in districts where Democrats didn't realize that they were vulnerable. So there's kind of a yin and a yang to that. But it seems that early voting is kind of taking control of the modern voting process. And if Republicans want to compete, they're going to have to do it as well. Trump says he's doing it. Johnny Pavetto, we will be lucky if we ever have a fair election again. Well, I mean, yeah, people are saying that now, but if Republicans win, are they going to say that was an unfair election? I mean, you feel good about an election when you win. You feel bad about an election when you lose. And then when it's very close, there's always allegations that something was amiss, but it could just be that, there were factors. You had 25 million jobs lost in 2020. You had a massive recession. That always portends very badly for an incumbent president. Trump was running with a recession. That was so before that happened, he was cruising to reelection, in my view. And COVID changed everything. It changed the rubric on the economy. It also changed the rubric on how we were going to vote that year. And so it was just an exceptional election. I think it kind of sticks in Trump's craw. And he's saying, I'm going to run for a third time, and this time I'm going to win. Let's see here. Villiers, Michael Jacobs. When it comes to voting, it should be the law that each person that votes should present a birth certificate along with ID. So you want to have voter ID laws. Obviously, there are several states that do have voter ID. Georgia was one of those states. They had voter ID. And even with the mail-in ballots, they had voter ID. You had to present ID to get a mail-in ballot, and Joe Biden still won. So there you go. Villiers, Michael Jacobs, thank you for your comment. It should be a law. We said that we did that one already. Sorry. Brian H. Dungan, I totally agree. Brian H. Duncan, poll watching is law. Yeah, you can have poll watchers. Republicans had kind of poll watchers that wanted to look at mail-in ballots. And they couldn't get too close to them because of social distancing and other ridiculous rules that were imposed during COVID. Joan Brayon, the only way Biden will win is corrupt elections. Again, they might not be corrupt if Democrats are able to turn out their base. Were those real registered voters? It seems so. So they can get more people to vote. Incumbent presidents are not invulnerable. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be bothering to run, opposing candidates. 70% of the time they can lose. Jimmy Carter lost. Gerald Ford lost, George Herbert Walker Bush, he lost, Donald Trump lost. It's not the first time it's happened, guys. And Trump's, he's not saying, oh, I can't possibly win, so I'm not going to run again. No, he's running again. He thinks he can win. He thinks he can win with the rules such as they are. Carol Spencer Liam, no rhinos. Let's see here. Brian H. Duncan, vote out red. Whose side of Democrat or with Democrats and all blue? Randy Horde, Democrats are a joke. Randy Horde, Joe Biden did not win the election. It's all fake ballots. So we got, still very controversial. I can see that the 2020 election is, very much in everybody's minds. The question is that going to inspire independents to want to vote for Trump? Should he run on the outcome of 2020? What are you going to do in 2024 if you're elected former President Trump? Oh, we're going to look at the 2020 results. Like, if you win, why would you bother? You're going to be term limited at that point. I bet you independents are going to want to hear, what are you going to do about the economy? How are you going to bring inflation down? What are you going to do about the trade deals? What about this out of control border? I bet you there's issues that maybe it animates Republicans in the primary to talk about the 2020 outcome. And maybe that helps Trump to win the primary, but it might not help him win the general election if he needs at least a few Democrats, Reagan-style Democrats who voted for him in 2016. Trump wins because Democrats in Pennsylvania and Michigan, enough of them vote for him. And independents, he's winning independents in those states. Do independents and potential Democrats who might cross over, Robert Kennedy voters per se, who might be the stronger challenger in the Democratic primary, do they want to hear about, Trump's kind of sore loser talk from 2020? Probably not. That might not be a winner. Trump ran very strongly in 2016. He ran very strongly in 2020. And there was no question. There was no question of his confidence as he was pursuing policies. He was running because of policies. If it's merely about, kind of getting revenge on his political opponents or trying to relitigate 2020, it might not go the way he hopes. So the question is, can Trump turn the page and can he make a pitch in the general election? If you think it all comes down to what are the rules of the election, that's how you win. Well, look at the rules in your states and then go by those rules. If they allow for early voting, push for early voting. I bet you'll do better if more people vote early. Then you have fewer people you need to turn out on election day, and you can go to even lower propensity voters on election day and say, hey, would you consider voting? That's how you're going to win. If you have ballot harvesting in California, Republicans have already figured it out. Hey, we need to harvest ballots too. It's legal there. If you're going to have mail-in ballots, depending on which state you're in, and Democrats are using mail-in ballots, well, Republicans should use mail-in ballots as well, and they can achieve parity and then try to win on election day. If you get even on early voting, you're going to do much, much better in the general election. Let's see here. Sean Wagers, good Lord. Mike Fitz, I'd vote for Kennedy over Biden any day. Well, there you go. So I got a Kennedy supporter. Mike Fitz, Biden won't debate. He's not capable. Well, that's what voters say. They say he's not fit to be president. He's too old. That was Harvard's. Betsy Burns, if the Republicans don't change how they are doing performance, they could lose again. Yeah, I agree. I think Republicans need to pay attention to what they're going to do to maximize their advantages in the general election, whatever they happen to be. If Donald Trump is an advantage because he gets more low propensity voters, people who don't usually vote, to turn out and vote for him, well, maybe they should consider him as a nominee, especially if he's leading the polls and he ends up winning primaries. Don't try to steal it at the convention. I mean, the Republicans in the 20th century, they kept on saying, oh, yeah, we'll just run Dewey. If we run Dewey, clearly we can defeat either Roosevelt or Truman, and it never worked. Going against whoever's winning the primaries is never a winner. Let's see here. Joan Pate. Biden has got to be defeated. Mike Fitz, Claire's right. Charmin Wilkie, one vote on one day for each American citizen only. See, you could change all the laws. You could have Congress pass a law that says just day of voting. That's the way it used to be, and they need to have exceptions for absentee and early mail-ins or overseas mail-ins from military, for example. So you could have Congress pass a law that do have that power to change, to regulate the elections. So you could, Republicans win both houses of Congress, probably with filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. They've never had one, by the way. But maybe you could get a bipartisan bill and everyone says, no, we want to have day of election voting from now on. But that's not going to be the rules in 2024. So it's one thing to wish about what the laws you wish would be, and to have like, oh, everyone should do voter ID, only day of voting. But those aren't going to be the rules. So Republicans have to adapt to what the rules are going to actually be in 2024. You can't just ignore the rules and say, oh, it's not fair. Boo-hoo. It's like, it would be like the Grinch and saying all the Who's down in Whoville crying, boo-hoo, we didn't change the election laws. Oh, boo-hoo, we couldn't win because we didn't change the laws. Or you could actually adapt to the laws. And so Republicans need to get smart. They need to get organized. If they want to have any chance against Joe Biden, again, just because there might be a recession and just because there might be a significant primary challenge, the fact is unemployment hasn't gone up yet, and there hasn't been a single vote cast in the Democratic primaries yet. So all of my, analysis about what might predict the outcome of 2024 is by no means a fait accompli. And we still have to see what's going to actually happen. And usually presidents, when they run for re-election, 70% of the time, they're going to win. Joe Biden's going to have the bully pulpit. He's going to have the advantage. And it's up to Republicans, if they hope to defeat him, to find ways to do so within the confines of the law. Let's see here. Mike Fitz, fraudulent mail-in ballots again. Why do they have to be fraudulent, though? Maybe they weren't fraudulent. Maybe they just had, 4 months of early voting and they said, oh, yeah, well, here's our list of people. Let's go one by one and encourage them to vote because they're afraid of COVID and they only have to walk, 50 feet to their mailboxes. Maybe it's actually easier to vote by mail than it is, you had record turnout in 2020. Actually, a pretty significant majority of Republicans actually used early voting and mail-in voting in states like Georgia. So it's just like, oh, we can't, but we have to vote on election day. Yes, a bunch of people did vote on election day, but significant majorities of Republicans were actually voting early in 2020 as well. So if all the mail-ins are fraudulent, maybe they're not. Maybe Republicans were using mail-in ballots too. They just didn't use as many of them as the Democrats did. How's that for an explanation? I know that's not what Trump was saying in 2020, but you have to look at it. Why is Trump now shifting and saying he's going to do mail-in ballots? He's going to emphasize early voting. It's because he sees the advantage of doing so politically. Let's see here. Linda Haynes, Acton Smith. The Democrats in the House are not capable of nothing but trash. Trump was millions ahead until they shut everything down. Gee, I wonder what happened. Biden won. He's the president. It's over. It's like, yeah, you're going to, you lose, but you're going to go on and you're going to try to win again. That's what the American system is. Even when there's a close election, Richard Nixon lost a close election in 1960. Many Republicans wanted him to do a challenge. He said, no, I'm not going to try that. That won't work anyways. But he went on to run again. And in 1968, he was elected. So you can lose one time, a close election, and go on to win. Richard Nixon proved it could be done. Theodore Roosevelt, again, he could have been president for a third time. If Republicans pay attention to who's winning the primaries, maybe it'll be Trump and maybe they'll have a better chance with him on the ballot. Let's see here. We're almost to the bottom of the chat here. Betty Vargo, any corrupt Democrat will never get my vote. Is there one that isn't evil? No. Well, I mean, you can look at the Democrats if you're a Democrat primary voter. You don't sound like a Democrat primary voter. You don't have to vote for the Democrats if you don't want to, if you think they're all corrupt. Jenny Welsh, no, the Democrats need to be stopped. Betsy Burns, we have voter ID here in Indiana. Yeah, so there's states with voter ID. Not every state's going to do it though. So if you have a state without voter ID, then you're a Republican running and you want to do well in that state. Well, voter ID won't be any barrier. I guess you could go find people without IDs and say, hey, why don't you vote too? Mike Fitz, rhinos are a huge problem for the Republican Party. Although I saw Romney giving the Democrats the business at a congressional hearing, I nearly fainted. Yeah, sometimes a broken clock is right twice a day, usually. Clara Nussbaum, what about the number of votes in a city that were larger than the population of that city and county? Dead people voting. So you can have situations where the population grows after a census is taken and say, oh, what's the population of the city? But the population keeps going up because more people move to the city or something like that, or a county. So I suppose you could see more people who were, and then you have to factor in, do they have day of voting registration? Can people show up at the polls and register that day? Do they get to file a provisional ballot? How does that work? And does it factor into the count? And it varies state by state. So I think there's more analysis that needs to be done than simply looking at the last census count and then the current vote tally, because they might not be the same. Betsy Burns, I thought it was better to vote on election day. So you taught me something. This year, I'll vote early. See, there is hope. There is hope for Republicans if they're going to adapt to whatever the laws are in their state and say, hey, we need to run the elections based upon what the laws actually are, not what we wish the laws were. Because that's more advantageous to understand what your environment is when you're going into. Certainly, you need to know your environment and if you're trying to start a business, if you're going to run a campaign, you need to know what's the environment, what are my obstacles, what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses, and then you kind of go from there. And then you're going to, there's no other way to win. You got to get more votes in the electoral college. So you're going to be playing to win the electoral college. I expect that Republicans, whether it's Trump, DeSantis, or somebody else, you figure they're going to run pretty strong in Florida and Ohio again. So what are you going to focus on? You're going to focus on those Rust Belt states. You're going to look at Wisconsin again. You're going to look at Michigan. You're going to look at Pennsylvania. Also, Nevada is still closely contested. So could Republicans do better in Nevada? And then Republicans need to really get to work in Arizona and Georgia. They weren't paying attention there. Trump wasn't campaigning in those two states as much as he thought he needed to, perhaps. Maybe he thought he had those locked up, but they weren't locked up. Hillary Clinton, she ignored Michigan in 2016. So did Trump spend enough time in Arizona and enough time in Georgia in 2020? Could that have been a factor as well? So Republicans, obviously Biden won those two states. So if they want to do well in those two states, they have to get to work and they're going to have to try harder. Democrats clearly learned their lesson in 2020. They did, much better in Michigan and Pennsylvania than they did in 2016. And Joe Biden was a stronger candidate than Hillary Clinton. When you get down to it, working class voters didn't trust Hillary Clinton. And many of them voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and then they voted for Donald Trump in the general election. And to put him over the top, Trump won by pretty narrow majorities in Michigan and Pennsylvania. It was and Wisconsin. Those were very close races. Could have easily gone the other way, but Trump had enough people just to grab an edge in that 2016 election. And so you get kind of a demographic kind of issue at play as well, where there's way many more registered Democrats than Republicans. And so people wonder, like, when the baby boomers are passing away, which party is going to be larger after that? You see 18 to kind of 30-year-olds, they're going to skew Democrat, but can Republicans win 30-year-olds or 35-year-old and above? If they can win 35 and above across the board and very significantly, this might be a very good year in 2024. Let's see here. Linda Haynes, Acton Smith. You must be a Democrat. Nope, never been a Democrat. I've actually personally, I voted for Donald Trump in the Republican primary in 2016. And I was proud to vote for him that year against Hillary Clinton. And I was proud to vote for him again in 2020 and against Joe Biden. So, no, I've never voted for the Democrats. Let's see. Donna D. black. 2020, husband and I drove Western Pennsylvania, and honest to God, we saw 2 vote Biden signs. The rest were for Trump. That's true. Donald Trump crushed it. Everything west of Philadelphia, that was Trump country. But they managed to get. He didn't do as well in the suburbs, though, surrounding Philadelphia. That seems to have been a difference. Obviously, Democrats are going to win Philadelphia. But Bucks County and places like that, Trump needed to have a much stronger showing. So you saw that Democrats, and really he didn't lose any votes. Democrats were able to maximize more votes than the Republicans were. Trump built his coalition. He picked up 11 million votes from 2016 to 2020. And in a normal election cycle, minus COVID and minus the kind of difference in the voting rules in 2020, Trump probably would have easily won election because the economy would have still been very strong. And you wouldn't have had those changes to election rules. So you want to say that the changes to the rules, to the election laws and rules in 2020 was a determinative factor. I'm not going to disagree with you. But, clearly Biden got more votes. I mean, you can just look it up. Who won the election? Who's the president right now? Who's in the White House? It's not Trump. Let's see here. Bill Skinner, they cheated, and that's a fact. Broke laws, changing election laws is against the law. Now, one thing that was disappointing to me was that the Supreme Court never took up the changes to the election laws that occurred without state legislatures challenge, leaving aside the, were the right people, were people showing up to the polls? Did people put ballots in the mail? Clearly, they did put ballots in the mail, but were governors using executive actions to change the rules? And was that constitutional? Did that violate the 14th Amendment's equal protection? I thought that was the strongest constitutional case that Trump had if he was going to have a chance to challenge the election. But the Supreme Court never heard those challenges, and I think that probably led to a lot of discontent following the outcome of the election, certainly on January 6th, when Trump's doing the Save America rally, and then there's the riot at the Capitol. Was that a preventable outcome if the Supreme Court had heard the constitutional case? Even if they were going to determine that actually it was too late, the states had already certified and affirmed the precedent they set up in Bush v. Gore, at least they could have heard the constitutional challenges and maybe said, but you know what? You can't change the rules midstream and then have an outcome, and maybe set up a precedent where no, the states have to change their laws in order for the election rules to be changed. They could have had a split decision there, perhaps. Who knows how the Supreme Court might have decided such a case, because they never heard it. But they probably should have. I think in hindsight, maybe they wish they had heard that case. Because maybe it would have settled some of these disputes about whether, the state legislatures needed to change their laws officially and not just have court orders or executive actions that are going to try to change it without a vote of the legislature. So I disagreed with the states that were changing their laws without a vote in the legislature. I didn't think that was right, and I thought that was ripe for a challenge. And we were at Americans for Limited Government very disappointed that the Supreme Court never took up that case and was able to kind of weigh and measure what those arguments would be. I thought it would have been an interesting court case, and it might have led to more acceptance of the outcome of the election. So even if Trump had challenged it but still lost it to the Supreme Court, everyone would have said, oh yeah, they tried everything to try to challenge this, and so we're not as upset as we would have been. But instead, the Supreme Court didn't hear the challenge, and that was provocative. Maybe they should have heard the challenge. That would have been better. I don't know who you are, but Biden did not win. I'm Robert Romano, Americans for Limited Government. Thanks for watching the live stream. Clearly, people are still upset about 2020. I'm not going to be the most popular person saying that Biden won, but clearly he's the president. Stephanie Butler, the country is toast. Why should we believe you? Bill Skinner says you don't have Ben know how to keep your hair. My family was from Southern Italy. My father was bald and my grandfather was bald. My mother's father was bald. So a grandfather on the other side. Everyone's bald in, Sicily. So that's okay, though. We don't need hair. Philip Ogaiba. The Democrats were caught writing in ballots. Okay, so a lot of election challenges here. Michael Fitz, I'm a former Democrat. I changed after Clinton. I saw the light. The Bill Skinner, and how is he supposed to have cheated? So you want to keep arguing about the election? That's fine. We'll skip those from now on. Michael Fitz, Hillary played Sanders. Robert Dilley, Trump 2024. Betsy Burns, this is for Senate, but I think Young will beat McManchin. So in West Virginia, Joe Manchin is going to have a significant challenge on his hand in 2024. But Democrats running with the incumbent, with the bully pulpit, can enough of the Manchin voters keep voting for Manchin? A lot of Republicans seem to like Joe Manchin in West Virginia. That seems to be why he keeps getting elected, even though it's a solid red state. And let's see here. Bill Skinner, too many women want to kill babies for Republicans to ever win again. 18 forms of birth control, not counting keeping your legs closed, and they want to kill babies. Yeah, so fertility has been declining significantly since the advent or the approval of birth control in the early 1960s. It used to be something like 3.5 babies per woman, and now it's less than 2 babies per woman. And it went down to less than 2 babies almost instantaneously, and it stayed that way throughout the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, the economy was doing better. And then, fertility seemed to normalize above or at about 2. And it stayed all the way above 2 through the so-called Great Moderation until the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And then fertility's been dropping like a stone ever since. I think it's down to about 1.6 babies per woman. And that's true in red states and in blue states. So Republicans aren't having babies either, not at replacement level. Not even Utah. Can you believe it? Not even Utah is above 2 babies per woman. It's kind of, that's the situation. Trump's talking about baby bucks. He thinks that maybe there should be a tax incentive or something else for people to have more children. If birth control is going to be kind of on the books in all 50 states, and do you need an incentive to have children that's above and beyond simply the love and gratitude of raising a family and be fruitful and multiply. That's what God says in the Bible. I'd be kind of in favor of perhaps some sort of incentive. If especially if we're going to have labor shortages, you want to see more babies, and you don't want to have demographic decline. You don't want to see 20 years without gross domestic product growth like Japan has seen. So they've had an even worse demographic situation over there in Japan. And we're about, 15 years behind them, but we're catching up in terms of the demographics. And when you're not producing population replacement and you have an aging population, you see what's happening with Social Security and Medicare. The reason why the trust funds are in danger of being exhausted is because baby boomers did not have enough children. And that includes Republicans and Democrats. It's not just Democrats who didn't have children. It was everybody. Or just not enough children to keep up with the population. So you had fewer taxpayers. And so the budget's going to go south. You're going to have huge budget deficits trying to pay for retirees. But I'm pretty confident Congress will keep its promises on Social Security and Medicare. Let's see. Fertility is a very interesting topic. Frank O'Keefe, it's not even mathematically possible that Biden won. Clearly, he won. I mean, if it's 50 feet to walk to your mailbox, you think they couldn't get there? And like everyone's like, there's a dangerous pandemic out there. It's not safe to go to the schools to vote. Maybe we should vote by mail. And you don't think they could pull it off? Come on, they pulled it off. R.G. Garcia, I think you favor Larry Fine. Let's see. Susan Lamb Heron, the jab causes infertility. Birth control is, you can look this up on St. Louis Fed if you want to look up fertility. In fact, I could just pull it up if we want to just take a look at this. If in case the seeing is believing, that's what the saying is. We can pull up fertility. We'll go over to the St. Louis Fed. Let's see here. I'm going to bring our screen back over here. StreamYard, you want to go over there? No, you don't want to go over there. Okay, that's fine. We'll go to St. Louis Fed. We'll look up fertility, U.S., St. Louis Fed. There's the fertility rate. There it is, in 1965. Let's make sure you can see that. Yeah, you can see that. In 1960, come over here. Fertility was at 3.65 babies per woman. And then, as I mentioned, it dropped like a stone after birth control was approved. And by 1970, it was at 2.5 babies per woman. But then he had a really crappy economy in the 1970s and starts going way down, down, down. By 1972, it's at 2 babies per woman. 1973, 1.87, and then 1.83, 1.73. And that was the all-time low. 1976, 1.73 babies per woman. And then it starts to rise a little bit. By the time you get to the 1980s, the economy's improving. And then finally, above 1990, you finally get back your head back above water demographically. It's up to 2.08 babies per woman. And then, as I mentioned, it pretty much stays at 2.1 babies in 2007. And that was the recent high water mark. And then after the financial crisis, the economy goes south. So, millennials and then later, I guess, Gen Zers, they're not getting married as much. And so they're deferring child rearing. If you're deferring marriage, you're deferring home purchases. You're also deferring child rearing, and fertility drops like a stone. And then in COVID, it's an even worse situation where people were postponing weddings in 2020 because of the pandemic. And then predictably, fertility goes down to 1.63 babies per woman, which is basically an all-time low. Jarn, I mean, if it was at 3.65 babies per woman in 1960, you figure that it was about that throughout the, all the decades that came before them, because they didn't have birth control. But with birth control and a really, really bad economy, fertility just drops like a stone. And so that really explains, I think, what happens with the fertility. So you can, people want to talk about what could be causing people to have less children. It's birth control. Just look at the numbers. You can do your own research. You don't have to take my word for it. But I'm pretty confident that that's what the problem is. Betsy Byrne, Democrats are trying to give pills to make them sterile. That would be a crime against humanity. Let's see. Sandra Mike, we must do something. We must end this stream. It's been going on for an hour and 20 minutes now. This is Robert Romano. Thank you for joining us with Americans for Limited Government. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy here. You can check us out at dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good evening.